Chapter 17, Part 1 of Fanny Herself. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Fanny Herself by Edna Ferber. Part 1 of Chapter 17. If Fanny Brandeis, the deliberately selfish, the calculatingly ambitious, was aghast at the trick fate had played her, she kept her thoughts to herself. Knowing her, I think she must have been grimly amused at finding herself saddled with a helpless baby, a bewildered peasant woman, and an artist brother, both helpless and bewildered. It was out of the question to house them in her small apartment. She found a furnished apartment near her own and installed them there, with a working housekeeper in charge. She had a gift for management, and she arranged all these details with a brisk capability that swept everything before it. A sunny bedroom for Mizzy, but then a bright living room, too, for Theodore's hours of practice. No noise. Chicago's roar maddened him. Otti shied at every new contrivance that met her eye. She had to be broken into elevators, electric switches, hot and cold faucets, radiators. No apartment ever built could cover all the requirements, Fanny confided to Fenger after the first harrowing week. What they really need is a combination palace, houseboat, sanatorium, and crèche. Look here, said Fenger, if I can help, why... A sudden thought struck him. Why don't you bring 'em all down to my place in the country? We're not there half the time. It's too cool for my wife in September. Just the thing for the child, and your brother could fiddle his head off. The Fengers had a roomy, wide verandahed house near Lake Forest, one of the many places of its kind that dot the section known as the North Shore. Its lawn sloped gently down to the water's edge. The house was gay with striped awnings and scarlet geraniums and chintz-covered chairs. The bright, sparkling, luxurious little place seemed to satisfy a certain beauty sense in Fenger, as did the etchings on the walls in his office. Fanny had spent a week-end there in July with 3 or 4 other guests, including Fascinating Facts. She had been charmed with it, and had announced that her energies thereafter would be directed solely toward the possession of just such a house as this, with a lawn that was lipped by the lake, awnings and geraniums to give it a French café air, books and magazines enough to belie that. "And I'll always wear white," she promised gaily, "and there'll be pictures on every table, frosty on the outside and minty on the inside, and you're all invited." They had laughed at that, and so had she, but she had been grimly in earnest just the same. She shook her head now at Fenger's suggestion. Imagine Mrs. Fenger's face at sight of Mizzy, and Theodore with his violin, and Otti with her shawls and paraphernalia. Though, she added seriously, it's mighty kind of you, and generous, and just like a man. It isn't kindness nor generosity that makes me want to do things for you. Modest, murmured Fanny wickedly, as always. Fenger bent his look upon her. Don't try the ingenue on me, Fanny. Theodore's manager, Kurt Stein, was to have followed him in 10 days. The war changed that. The war was to change many things. Fanny seemed to sense the influx of musicians that was to burst upon the United States following the first weeks of the catastrophe, and she set about forestalling it. Advertising. That was what Theodore needed. She had faith enough in his genius. But her business sense told her that this genius must be enhanced by the proper setting. She set about creating this setting. She overlooked no chance to fix his personality in the kaleidoscopic mind of the American public, or as much of it as she could reach. His publicity man was a dignified German-American, whose methods were legitimate and uninspired. Fanny's enthusiasm and superb confidence in Theodore's genius infected Fenger, Fascinating Facts, even Nathan Haynes himself. Nathan Haynes had never posed as a patron of the arts, in spite of his fantastic millions. But by the middle of September there were few of his friends, or his wife's friends, who had not heard of this Theodore Brandeis. In Chicago, Illinois, no one lives in houses, it is said, except the city's old families and new millionaires. The rest of the vast population is flat-dwelling. To say that Nathan Haynes' spoken praise reached the city's house-dwellers would carry with it a significance plain to any Chicagoan. As for Fanny's method, here is a typical example of her somewhat crude effectiveness in showmanship. Ati had brought with her from Vienna her native peasant costume. It is a costume seen daily in the Austrian capital, on the Ring, in the Stade Park, wherever Viennese nurses convene with their small charges. To the American eye it is a musical comedy costume, picturesque, bouffant, amazing. Your Austrian takes it quite for granted. Regardless of the age of the nurse, the skirt is short, coming a few inches below the knees, and built like a lampshade, in color usually a bright scarlet, with rows of black velvet ribbon at the bottom. Beneath it are worn skirts and skirts and skirts, so that the opera bouffe effect is complete. The bodice is black velvet, laced over a chemise of white. The headgear is a sword winged affair of starchly stiffed white, that is a pass between the Breton peasant woman's cap and an aeroplane. Black stockings and slippers finish the costume. Ati and Mizzi spent the glorious September days in Lincoln Park, Ati garbed in staid American stripes and apron, Mizzi resplendent in smartest of children's dresses, provided for her lavishly by her aunt. Her fat and dimpled hands smoothed the blue or pink or white folds with a complacency astonishing in one of her years. That's her mother in her, Fanny thought. One rainy autumn day Fanny entered her brother's apartment to find Ati resplendent in her Viennese nurse's costume. Mizzi had been cross and fretful, and the sight of the familiar scarlet and black and white and the great winged cap seemed to soothe her. "Ati!" Fanny exclaimed. "You gorgeous creature! What is it? A dress rehearsal?" Ati got the import, if not the English. "So gehen wir in Wien," she explained, and struck a killing pose. "Everybody? All the nurses? Alle?" "Aber, sure." Ati displayed her half-dozen English words wherever possible. Fanny stared a moment. Her eyes narrowed thoughtfully. "Tomorrow's Saturday," she said in German. "If it's fair and warm, you put on that costume and take Mizzi to the park. Certainly the animal cages if you want to. If anyone annoys you, come home. If a policeman asks you why you are dressed that way, tell him it is the costume worn by nurses in Vienna. Give him your name. Tell him who your master is. If he doesn't speak German, and he won't in Chicago, someone will translate for you." Not a Sunday paper in Chicago that did not carry a startling picture of the resplendent Ati and the dimpled and smiling Mizzi. The omnipresent staff photographer seemed to sniff his victim from afar. He pounced on Theodore Brandeis's baby daughter, accompanied by her Viennese nurse, in costume, and he played her up in a Sunday special that was worth thousands of dollars, Fanny assured the bewildered and resentful Theodore, as he floundered wildly through the billowing waves of the Sunday newspaper flood. Theodore's first appearance was to be in Chicago as soloist with the Chicago Symphony Orchestra in the season's opening program in October. Any music-wise Chicagoan will tell you that the Chicago Symphony Orchestra is not only a musical organization functioning marvelously when playing Beethoven, it is an institution. Its patrons will admit the existence, but not the superiority of similar organizations in Boston, Philadelphia, and New York. On Friday afternoons during the season, Orchestra Hall, situate on Michigan Boulevard, holds more pretty girls and fewer men than one might expect to see at any one gathering other than, perhaps, a wholesale debutante tea crush. A Friday afternoon ticket is as impossible of attainment for one not a subscriber as a seat in heaven for a sinner. Saturday night's audience is staider, more masculine, less staccato. Gallery, balcony, parquet, it represents the city's best. Its men prefer Beethoven to Berlin. Its women could wear pearl necklaces, and don't. Between the audience and the solemn black and white rows on the platform there exists an entente cordiale. The Concertmeister bows to his friend in the third row as he tucks his violin under his chin. The fifth row aisle smiles and nods to the sausage-fingered cellist. Fritz is playing well tonight. In a rarefied form, it is the atmosphere that existed between audience and players in the days of the old and famous Daily Stock Company. Such was the character of the audience Theodore was to face on his first appearance in America. Fanny explained its nature to him. He shrugged his shoulders in a gesture as German as it was expressive. Theodore seemed to have become irrevocably German during the years of his absence from America. He had a queer stock of little foreign tricks. He lifted his hat to men acquaintances on the street. He had learned to smack his heels sharply together and to bow stiffly from the waist, and to kiss the hand of the matrons, and they adored him for it. He was quite innocent of pose in these things. He seemed to have imbibed them, together with his queer German haircut and his incredibly German clothes. Fanny allowed him to retain the bow and the courtly hand-kiss, but she insisted that he change the clothes and the haircut. "You'll have to let it grow, Ted. I don't mean that I want you to have a mane like Ysaye, but I do think you ought to discard that convict cut. Besides, it isn't becoming, and if you're going to be an American violinist you'll have to look it, with a foreign finish." He let his hair grow. Fanny watched with interest for the appearance of the unruly lock which had been wont to straggle over his white forehead in his schoolboy days. The new and well-cut American clothes effected surprisingly little change. Fanny, surveying him, shook her head. "When you stepped off the ship you looked like a German in German clothes. Now you look like a German in American clothes. I don't know. I do believe it's your face, Ted. I wouldn't have thought that 10 years or so in any country could change the shape of one's nose and mouth and cheekbones. Do you suppose it's the umlauts?" "Cut it out," laughed Ted, that being his idea of modern American slang. He was fascinated by these crisp phrases, but he was 10 years or so behind the times, and he sometimes startled his hearers by an exhibition of slang so old as to be almost new. It was all the more startling in contrast with his conversational English, which was as carefully correct as a born German's. As for the rest, it was plain that he was interested, but unhappy. He practiced for hours daily. He often took Mizzy to the park, and came back storming about the dirt, the noise, the haste, the rudeness, the crowds, the mismanagement of the entire city. Dummheit, he called it. They profaned the lake. They allowed the people to trample the grass. They threw papers and banana skins about, and they wasted. His years in Germany had taught him to regard all these things as sacrilege, and the last as downright criminal. He was lonesome for his Germany, that was plain. He hated it and loved it, much as he hated and loved the woman who had so nearly spoiled his life. The maelstrom known as the southwest corner of State and Michigan streets appalled him. "Gott!" he exclaimed. "Es ist unglaublich, aber ganz unglaublich. Ich werd bald verrückt." He somehow lapsed into German when excited. Fanny took him to the Haynes Cooper plant one day, and it left him dazed and incredulous. She quoted millions at him. He was not interested. He looked at the office workers, the mail-room girls, and shook his head dumbly. They were using bicycles now, with a bundle rack in the front in the vast stock-rooms, and the roller skates had been discarded as too slow. The stock boys skimmed around corners on these light-weight bicycles, up one aisle and down the next, snatching bundles out of bins, shooting bundles into bins, as expertly as players in a gymkhana. Theodore saw the uncanny rapidity with which the letter-opening machines did their work. He watched the great presses that turned out the catalog whose message meant millions. He sat in Fenger's office and stared at the etchings, and said, "Certainly," with politeness, when Fenger excused himself in the midst of a conversation to pick up the telephone receiver and talk to their shoe factory in Maine. He ended up finally in Fanny's office, no longer a dingy and undesirable corner, but a quietly brisk center that sent out vibrations over the entire plant. Slosson, incidentally, was no longer of the infant's wear. He had been transferred to a subordinate position in the grocery section. "Well," said Fanny, seating herself at her desk and smiling radiantly upon her brother. "Well, what do you think of us?" And then Theodore Brandeis, the careless, the selfish, the blind, said a most amazing thing. "Fanny, I'll work. I'll soon get some of these millions that are lying about everywhere in this country, and then I'll take you out of this, I promise." Fanny stared at him, a picture of ludicrous astonishment. "Why, you talk as if you were sorry for me." "I am, dear. God knows I am. I'll make it up to you, somehow." It was the first time in all her dashing and successful career that Fanny Brandeis had felt the sting of pity. She resented it hotly, and from Theodore, the groper, But at any rate, something within her said, he has always been true to himself. Theodore's manager arrived in September on a Holland boat, on which he had been obliged to share a stuffy inside cabin with 3 others. Kurt Stein was German-born, but American-bred, and he had the American love of luxurious travel. He was still testy when he reached Chicago and his charge. "How goes the work?" he demanded at once of Theodore. He eyed him sharply. "That's better. You have lost some of the look you had when you left Vienne." The ladies would have liked that look here in America, but it is bad for the work." He took Fanny aside before he left. His face was serious. It was plain that he was disturbed. "That woman," he began. "Pardon me, Mrs. Brandeis. She came to me. She says she's starving. She is alone there in Vienna. Well, she is alone. The war is everywhere. They say it will last for years. She wept and pleaded with me to take her here." "No!" cried Fanny. "Don't let him hear it. He mustn't know. Yes, I know. She's a paradox, that woman. I tell you, she almost prevailed on me. There is something about her, something that repels and compels." That struck him as being a very fine phrase indeed, and he repeated it appreciatively. "I'll send her money, somehow," said Fanny. "Yes, but they say that money is not reaching them over there. I don't know what becomes of it. It vanishes." He turned to leave. "Oh, a message for you. On my boat was Schabelitz. It looks very much as if his great fortune, the accumulation of years, would be swept away by this war. Already they are tramping up and down his lands in Poland. His money, much of it, is invested in great hotels in Poland and Russia, and they are using them for barracks and hospitals." "Schabelitz? You mean a message for Theodore? From him? That's wonderful." "For Theodore, and for you, too." "For me? I made a picture of him once when I was a little girl. I didn't see him again for years. Then I heard him play. It was on his last tour here. I wanted to speak to him, but I was afraid, and my face was red with weeping." "He remembers you, and he means to see Theodore and you. He can do much for Theodore in this country, and I think he will. His message for you was this: tell her I still have the picture that she made for me, with the jack-in-the-box in my hand, and that look on my face. Tell her I have often wondered about that little girl in the red cap and the black curls. I've wondered if she went on catching that look back of people's faces. If she did, she should be more famous than her brother." "He said that? About me?" "I am telling you as nearly as I can. He said, 'Tell her it was a woman who ruined Bauer's career, and caused him to end his days as a music teacher in Gott, I can't remember the name of that town.'" "Winnebago." "Winnebago, that was it. Tell her not to let the brother spoil his life that way. So, that is the message. He said you would understand." Theodore's face was ominous when she returned to him, after Stein had left. "I wish you and Stein wouldn't stand out there in the hall, whispering about me as if I were an idiot patient. What were you saying?" "Nothing, Ted, really." He brooded a moment. Then his face lighted up with a flash of intuition. He flung an accusing finger at Fanny. "He has seen her." "Ted, you promised." "She's in trouble, this war, and she hasn't any money, I know. Look here, we've got to send her money. Cable it." "I will. Just leave it all to me." "If she's here, in this country, and you're lying to me—" "She isn't. My word of honor, Ted." He relaxed. Life was a very complicated thing for Fanny these days. Ted was leaning on her, Mizzi, Oddie, and now Fenger. Nathan Haynes was poking a disturbing finger into that delicate and complicated mechanism of system which Fenger had built up in the Haynes-Cooper plant, and Fenger, snarling, was trying to guard his treasure. He came to Fanny with his grievance. Fanny had always stimulated him, reassured him, given him the mental readjustment that he needed. He strode into her office one morning in late September. Ordinarily he sent for her. He stood by her desk now, a sheaf of papers in his hand, palpably stage props, and lifted significant eyebrows in the direction of the stenographer busy at her typewriter in the corner. "You may leave that, Miss Mahan," Fanny said. Miss Mahan, a comprehending young woman, left it, and the room as well. Fenger sat down. He was under great excitement, though he was quite controlled. Fanny, knowing him, waited quietly. His eyes held hers. "It's come," Fenger began. "You know that for the last year Haynes has been milling around with a herd of sociologists, philanthropists, and students of economics. He had some scheme in the back of his head, but I thought it was just another of his impractical ideas. It appears that it wasn't. Between the lot of them they've evolved a savings and profit-sharing plan that's founded on a kind of practical, universal brotherhood dream. Haynes' millions are bothering him. If they actually put this thing through, I'll get out. It'll mean that everything I've built up will be torn down. It'll mean that any $6-a-week girl—" "As I understand it," interrupted Fanny, "it will mean that there will be no more $6-a-week girls." "That's it. And let me tell you, once you get the ignorant, unskilled type to be believing they're actually capable of earning decent money, actually worth something, they're worse than useless. They're dangerous."
You don't believe that.
"I do."
But it's a theory that belongs to the Dark Ages. We've disproved it. We've got beyond that.
"Yes, so was war. We'd got beyond it. But it's here. I tell you there are only two classes, the governing and the governed. That has always been true. It always will be. Let the socialist rave. It has never got them anywhere. I know. I come from the mucker class myself. I know what they stand for. Boost them and they'll turn on you. If there's anything in any of them, he'll pull himself up by his own bootstraps."
They're not all potential Fengers.
"Then let 'em stay where they are." Fanny's pencil was tracing and retracing a tortured and meaningless figure on the paper before her.
Tell me, do you remember a girl named Sarah Sapinsky?
"Never heard of her."
That's fitting. Sarah Sapinsky was a very pretty, very dissatisfied girl who was a slave to the bundle chute. One day there was a period of 2 seconds when a bundle didn't pop out at her and she had time to think. Anyway, she left. I asked about her. She's on the streets.
"Well?"
Thanks to you and your system.
"Look here, Fanny, I didn't come to you for that kind of talk. Don't, for heaven's sakes, give me any sociological drivel today. I'm not here just to tell you my troubles. You know what my contract is here with Haynes Cooper, and you know the amount of stock I hold. If this scheme of Haynes goes in, I go out, voluntarily, but at my own price. The Haynes Cooper plant is at the height of its efficiency now." He dropped his voice. "But the mail order business is in its infancy. There's no limit to what can be done with it in the next few years. Understand? Do you get what I'm trying to tell you?" He leaned forward, tense, and terribly in earnest. Fanny stared at him. Then her hand went to her head in a gesture of weariness. "Not today, please, and not here. Don't think I'm ungrateful for your confidence. But this month has been a terrific strain. Just let me pass the 15th of October. Let me see Theodore on the way." Fenger's fingers closed upon her wrist. Fanny got to her feet angrily. They glared at each other a moment. Then the humor of the picture they must be making struck Fanny. She began to laugh. Fenger's glare became a frown. He turned abruptly and left the office. Fanny looked down at her wrist ruefully. 4 circlets of red marked its smooth whiteness. She laughed again, a little uncertainly this time. When she got home that night she found in her mail a letter for Theodore, postmarked Vienna, and stamped with the mark of the censor. Theodore had given her his word of honor that he would not write to Olga or give her his address. Olga was risking Fanny's address. She stood looking at the letter now. Theodore was coming in for dinner, as he did 5 nights out of the week. As she stood in the hallway, she heard the rattle of his key in the lock. She flew down the hall and into her bedroom, her letters in her hand. She opened her dressing-table drawer and threw them into it, switched on the light, and turned to face Theodore in the doorway. "'Lo, sis."
"Hello, Teddy. Kiss me." "Phew! That pipe again. How'd the work go today?"
"So-so. Any mail for me?"
"No."
That night, when he had gone, she took out the letter and stood turning it over and over in her hands. She had no thought of reading it. It was its destruction she was contemplating. Finally, she tucked it away in her handkerchief box. Perhaps after the 15th of October. Everything depended on that. End of Part 1 of Chapter 17.